are listening to the Bell Post. Welcome to episode 46 of the Bell Post. Today, we're going to talk reports. And, if you look at our subject matter index, we kind of break up everything that we've ever talked about. And we have a couple of episodes on reports. We have an episode from some scientist that talks about why people languish in jail. And today, we're going to be talking about another report about the myth of whether there's unwarranted racial disparities in Minnesota's criminal justice system. And our guest today is David Zimmer. Mr. Zimmer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
You are a policy fellow at the Center of American Experiment. Talk about what that is.
Yeah, the Center of the American Experiment is a think tank based here in Minnesota. We've got policy fellows that deal with a wide range of issues, everything from healthcare to governance to education to energy. And in 2022, they started a position that I accepted dealing with public safety issues. And it really spawned out of the civil unrest that we experienced here in Minnesota starting in 2020.
So it's a group that's been around forever,
right,
by our standards.
Sure.
You have a background in law enforcement as well. Would you talk about that?
Yeah, I served 33 years as a sheriff's deputy and up through the rank of captain here in the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office, which is the county that encompasses Minneapolis. So I served in a wide range of public safety focused areas throughout my career. And I think it served me well as I moved into this position in my retirement years.
Somebody asked me yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, they're like, Ken, I don't think people just grow up dreaming about being in the bail world. I mean, what brought you to criminal justice, to law enforcement?
That's a good question. Nobody in my family, I don't have a family history. I'm not following my dad into law enforcement or anything, but I've just always had a strong passion for doing the right thing and making sure that my community was safe and secure. And so it just seemed to be the perfect fit for me as I was looking for a career as a young man.
My wife is also an attorney, and I describe us as she is the rule follower in our family. And I am, the rules are guidelines for me sometimes, and especially for house rules. But I think that when you get to the criminal justice, though, we're not talking about that type of rule follower, the people who cuts corners. I mean, when we're talking about criminal justice, the purpose of our laws is to keep peace, to make the public safe. What got you so you were in law enforcement for around 30 years, and you came to this Center of American Experiment. I mean, I don't see a lot of people that have your background and then go into this think tank or policy group, and suddenly you start writing reports.
Right. Yeah, it is a little unique what we're finding, and what I have found since I've stepped into this role is there aren't a lot of policy fellows that deal with public safety issues around the country. It's kind of a new position in these think tanks around the country.
But I think it's needed. I think it's needed because there's a lot of information, and what we're going to talk about today is great information that has not been available before your report.
Right. Yeah, and I think I bring, with my history in the system, I bring some institutional knowledge about what's going on in the system, what are some of the narratives that might not match up with the facts, and that's helped me so far in this position.
So in July 2023, you released, or the Center of American Experiment released your paper that it's entitled Dispelling the Myth of Unwarranted Racial Disparities in Minnesota's Criminal Justice System. Talk about how that came about and what happened that suddenly made this report possible in 2021.
Well, one of the narratives, like I was just talking about, one of the narratives that I was aware of and experienced throughout, at least late in my career, was this narrative of Black Minnesotans being disparately affected by the criminal justice system. And one of the things I noticed and others noticed was that the narrative was based on using the general population in the calculation
Mhm.
of who was being affected in the system. And in 2021, our State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, for the first time, started tracking and publishing offender data by race, which allowed me or anyone to, for the first time, take a focused look on who was committing the offenses and who was entering the system, and then track that group as they traverse through the system. And it allows for a much more focused look instead of using these massive general population data sets, the vast majority of which are law-abiding people. They have nothing to do with the system. Uh, so using a more focused data set, the offenders, allows for a more focused evaluation.
Let me just kind of highlight that for just a moment. When you're talking about offender data, you're talking about when someone is calling to say, hey, somebody is hit me, someone is doing this, or somebody's been attacked, or when they're calling in a complaint to be investigated. In 2021, for the first time, Minnesota was tracking the race of the person that the complaint was filed against.
That's right. Yep. And so it comes from 911 callers, it comes from victims who are reporting things to police, comes from witnesses, it comes from the police themselves.
Mhm.
And that the totality of those reports were collected by our state. And for the first time, we were able to see and break down by race who the criminal offenders in Minnesota were.
And so, I'm at the Texas legislature. I know we're talking about Minnesota, but I'm at the Texas legislature. I've heard the same thing. I've heard that we have systemic racism because we have a disproportionate percentage of certain races in our state jail. And it's based on the same assumption that you're talking about is here's what the general population is, here's what the population of the jail population is, and that is a disproportionate representation of the public. And so there must be some type of systemic racism as a result.
Right, right.
And
And
so
that's
what
what
did
my
the
report tries to get at is breaking or differentiating between a disproportion, which is just a mathematical equation, and a disparity, which is systems set up and outcomes that are unfair towards a certain group.
well, and I think your report makes multiple conclusions, and I don't want to get too far ahead. But one of the conclusions your report also says is if we have systemic racism, when we have the percentages that come in at the outside of the criminal justice system, you would presume that the racial disparities would get worse and worse and worse as we go through the system, and that's not what you found.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Yeah, so the way I think I phrase it is it would stand to reason that
Mm-hmm.
if there was racism throughout the system and disparities created throughout the system, the the proportions at the beginning, at the outset, would would grow dramatically throughout the system, and that's just not what I found at all.
So when we have the offender data, the data on the people who criminal complaints are being made against is being tracked for the first time in 2021, what was it showing about crime? Was it being committed in the same percentage of the population breakdown, or was it being committed in different percentages?
What I found, and it even shocked me coming from law enforcement 33 years, um, I knew there were some disproportions, but I didn't realize it was this grossly out of whack. I want to start by saying what I focused on in this report were serious crimes and crimes that were likely to lead to prison sentences. I
Sure.
didn't deal with traffic offenses and low-level misdemeanors and that kind of thing. But for these serious crimes, which I defined as murder, assault, robbery, weapons crimes, drug crimes, and rape, Black Minnesotans were 10 times more likely to be identified as a serious offender per capita than white Minnesotans. And so, throughout all of those crimes, they were disproportionately more likely to be an offender. For example, murder, 50 times more likely that a black Minnesotan was identified than a white Minnesotan. Uh, Assault, 16 times more likely. Robbery, an astounding 107 times more likely to be a robbery offender. So just throughout the gamut of those serious offenses, there was just this gross disproportion of black offending compared to white offenders.
That just is completely contrary to the narrative we hear today. And I quote a statistic whenever I speak on these issues that across the United States, the 50% of all murder victims nationwide currently is young black males. And
Yep.
and I argue that by and large, the murderer or the accused murderer of the 50% young black males is also young black males. And that's completely consistent with what you're finding at the offender level.
Right.
And so that's completely consistent with what we're hearing nationally. Why do you think the narrative is so the opposite, that we just have a systemic racial problem against a certain minority groups instead of just looking at data like this?
I can't answer that other than it's like I mentioned, it was almost shocking to me to see this gross disproportion. And so maybe it's just a kind of a disbelief by some that there's no way that things could be this out of whack. And this data, and it's not my data, it's data from our state. I just put it in proportions that were a little easier to digest.
Well, and the data
Um,
you're looking at is not tied to just inner cities. This is statewide data,
this is
correct?
statewide. That's right. That's right.
And so when
And
we compare the offender data and then we go back and we look at the arrest data for a comparison of, okay, we have a list of cases where the person, we have the offenders or the people who are accused of crimes, we have their racial makeup, but then we have a subset because I think everybody has tracked the race of the person who's actually arrested and has a criminal case charged on them. What was the difference in the data for the offender versus arrest?
well, that's where we saw this major switch. So whereas offenders were grossly disproportionately black, uh, surprisingly, when you get to arrests, that disproportion flips. And for serious crimes, white offenders were now 1.6 times more likely to be arrested for a serious offense. White murder offenders were 1.5 times more likely, 1.5 times or 50% more likely. Assaults, 1.5 times more likely. Robbery, 3 times more likely. Weapons, 1.3. That was actually the one outlier. Weapons, black offenders were 1.3 times more likely to be arrested. And I comment on in my report that likely has more to do with enforcement of high crime areas where the drive-by shootings and carjackings are just so prevalent.
We've already made the point that you also, when you were making this report or when y'all released this report, one of the points that you make is that if we have a systemic racial problem, you would have expected that as people were arrested and then went through the system, that the racial disparity or the treatment of the different races would grow, the disparate treatment for certain minorities, if there was systemic racism. And what did you find from arrest to sentencing? Did you find evidence to support systemic racism or to dispute it?
Yeah, it really refutes the narrative that these 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 ratios that arguably, I guess you could say, and I'm not making the argument, but arguably somebody could look at this and say, well, if there are disparities, it seems to be against white offenders. I'm not making that argument. But though the differences in the ratios from if you start at the arrests
Mhm.
and you move through who gets charged with crimes, through who is eventually sentenced. In our sentencing, a judge is able to take a look at the sentencing guideline and
Sure.
decide whether they're going to depart from that guideline or not. Through all of that, those sentencing aspects, the disproportions, if you will, that favor black offenders and disfavor white offenders really stays consistent throughout the report. So let me just give you an example here. So we talked about arrests. So for serious crime arrests, white offenders were 1.6 times more likely to be arrested for a serious crime. When you look at charges, white offenders were actually 1.8 times, so it grew 1.8 times more likely to be charged with a serious crime. For pronounced sentences, again, whites were 1.5, white offenders 1.5 times more likely to receive a pronounced prison sentence. If you move into actual sentences, so a judge can pronounce a sentence, but does the person actually go to prison? Well, it stayed consistent. Actual commitments to prison, white offenders were 1.5 times more likely to receive an actual prison commitment. In terms of those departures I talked about, black serious offenders were 1.6 times more likely to receive a downward durational departure, so on the amount of time they received
Mhm.
on their prison sentence. And then if you get into incarceration rates, or the ratios of who is actually incarcerated, again, it favors black serious offenders, disfavors white serious offenders. And ultimately, for all forms of incarceration, whether it's jail, workhouse, or prison, white serious offenders were 1.9 times more likely to receive some form of incarceration.
So if you were to say, okay, this is really the conclusion of this paper that was released that you drafted, what would you say is the conclusion of your paper?
Well, the conclusion is that if you go back to who's offending and what that ratio is, again, it was uh, blacks were offending at a ratio of 10 times that of white serious offenders, and you compare that to who is making up our prison population, you see that the narrative is blown away because the ratio of black prisoners to white prisoners is nearly exactly what the offender rate is, 9.6 times that of white prisoners. So if the system was systemically racist, it would stand to reason that uh, the offender ratio would grow considerably throughout
Mhm.
the system, and that we would actually have a larger ratio of prisoners than we have of offenders. And we don't see that at all. It's actually very, very similar.
You make a point in your paper that, while this is new information because we have the offender data for the first time, but this issue about whether there is racial disparity in the criminal justice system, that's been addressed in the past, like in 2015 by Heather McDonald. And she was saying that's one of the biggest problems with our criminal justice system is there's this narrative of racial disparity. And why did you, or what did she say that was so important that you thought you needed to cite that in your report?
Well, it's one of the few examples on a national level where um, somebody's conclusions were supportive of what I was concluding as well. And really I think she's getting at, what I'm getting at, and what a handful of others are, is that to perpetuate this narrative that we have this systemically racist criminal justice system is taking our eye off the ball of what changes to our criminal justice system, what those will, who those will actually impact. And if we change our system to gut accountability in the Black community, we are just going to set the Black community up for more and more victimization. And one of the last things I do in my report is I take a look at who the crime victims are in Minnesota.
Mhm.
And not surprisingly, when you have offense rates at what we've discussed, 10 to 1, Black to white, we actually also see victimization rates that almost mirror that. So Black Minnesotans in 2021 were 9.5 times more likely to be victims of these serious crimes we've listed. And that's a tragedy. And for a system to perpetuate this narrative and like I say, reduce accountability in the Black community, we're just making the law-abiding Black citizens bear the brunt of those policy decisions.
You also cited a 1994 Justice Department survey of felony cases from our 75 largest urban areas, and they found that Blacks actually had a lower chance of prosecution following a felony than whites in those areas. That's from 1994. So you have two different examples of other situations where this narrative that systemic racism is permeating the criminal justice system is contradicted. And then I think, the one thing that you pointed out just now, which is so important, is that the victim data mirrors the offender data. So the 10 to 1 is mirrored almost 9.5 to 1 on victims. So it's kind of like I've always said, the crimes are being committed by the same racial group on the same racial group. So if we have a disproportionate racial group committing crime, by and large, they're committing them on that same racial group. And I think your report actually confirms that.
Yeah, I think so too. And what I'm hoping, some that are willing to look at the results of my report will use this to help refocus efforts on, maybe what are some of the root crimes of that massive disproportionate offense rate in the Black community, whether it's broken families or
Mhm.
lack of home ownership, or all of these
Yeah.
potential root causes. Maybe we can refocus on that and help drive down the grossly disproportionate offense rates.
Well, you've mentioned that this data that you rely upon is publicly available, but what has been the reaction to your report?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've had very little reaction, which, given it's kind of a pointed report, and I'm sure it's gotten under the skin of a number of people, but nobody has we're going on 5 months, I think. Nobody has published any sort of factual rebuttal that challenges any of the data. The data is what the data is. It's right from our state, and so it's really irrefutable data. The one comment I've had, and it's from a person that does pretty much the opposite of what I do.
Sure.
They're a policy fellow, but they're advocating for more progressive policies. And he just questioned how will this information help, Dave? And he was a little concerned that it wouldn't help. And I guess my response to him was, the truth can't hurt. If we get the truth out and start dispelling these narratives that have been wrong all along, we can refocus our efforts, like I said, on things that will help drive down that disproportionate offense rate.
Well, I think the importance of this type of research, because I mean, let's don't even say, okay, we're not going to make a decision about whether it's correct, whether it's incorrect, but let's make an assumption. If this is correct, well, then we've been treating crime terribly because we've been taking and making policies that say, well, we have a system that is racist, so we must discount crime. We must help the certain minorities committing the crime. And actually, we're setting up policies that's going to make it actually even worse in those same minority groups. And I would argue that's exactly what we're seeing in some parts of the country where they're doing these policies.
Right. You know, I have a couple of examples throughout my career that I can think of just off the top of my head where, for example, our top 10 wanted list here in Hennepin County. I know at some points in my career, I had some involvement in creating those, and there was always the pressure to make sure we had a diverse top 10 list, not a
Mm.
top 10 list that represented the top 10 dangerous people that we need to get off the street, but rather let's have this diverse list that we couldn't be criticized for. Um, there's also the creation of what's called sign and release arrest warrants in Hennepin County. And they were the product of this narrative that, well, the system is disproportionately, affecting Black offenders. So what the court realized is that Black defendants were more likely to not appear for their court hearings, and they were receiving a disproportionately high number of failure to appear bench warrants. And so rather than just deal with that, they dealt with it by creating a new form of warrant, which is a sign and release warrant.
Mhm.
In effect, take another bite out of the apple. When the police would now come in contact with one of these offenders or defendants that had an arrest warrant, all they could do is issue a new court date for them and start the process all over again and hope they show up the second time. So it's processes like that, it's policies like that that this narrative have helped create, and I don't think it helps public safety one bit.
I would challenge elected officials to say, look, find out the real data for yourself. Because if the narrative that we have systemic racism is wrong, then we are doing several things. We're making it more likely that there will be higher levels of crime that will take place in our minority communities. If the
Absolutely.
narrative is wrong, then we are setting up a system that will commit higher crime in the very minority groups that we're seeking to protect. And also, if we're going to set up a system where neighborhoods, where certain racial groups are so devastated, overwhelmed by crime and criminal justice, our criminal justice system can't hold anybody accountable. I mean, we're seeing that in Harris County. When you get overwhelmed, then you have de facto decriminalization, and I would argue that's what we're seeing in the areas where these where your friend is saying, "How does that help?" Well, it actually helps to get the system straightened out to work for these very same minority communities.
Absolutely. That accountability is so important, that we have consistent accountability, like you're saying, and to subject, for example, the Black community to higher rates of offending. That's not that's a disparity, if you want to,
Yeah.
eh,
Well, there's some criminal justice theories that, I mean, we know how to address crime. We know how to get crime reduced, but we see these policies that are being advocated where we're really saying you can't do the things that historically work because of these narratives. And so we're really setting up systems for failure. And the report that you've done, I think, is so important for that reason. That's the reason why I contacted you and said, hey, I wanted to talk to you about this, because it at the very least, if you are an elected official who wants to improve the system, this has to raise questions in your mind. Because are we looking at persons who are arrested and the denominator is the public, the information of just the population, or should we be talking about offenders as the bottom number and the top number is the people arrested, and using that to determine whether we really have a disparate treatment of race by the criminal justice.
I totally agree, and I'm really shocked as I get into this line of work that that kind of comparison that I just did really hasn't been the norm. I don't know if it's I guess I don't know if it's a lack of ability to get at the more precise data or laziness or what, but
I was told to look at this website, harriscountycourtwatch.com, and it looks at 2 years worth of data from the misdemeanor courts. And it finds that there's an 80% failure to appear rate on average in all the misdemeanor courts in Harris County because they've given up on accountability. And when I first saw that, I was so shocked. I was like, that can't be true. I mean, it just can't be true. And then I talked to a DA on our podcast from California, and he's like, that's the same number we're finding across the state because we've given up on accountability on misdemeanors. You can't arrest somebody if they don't come to court. And you really can't do anything to them on a misdemeanor if they don't come to court. And so suddenly these numbers that are so shocking and you go, this can't be true. This just can't be where we're at in our system. I think your report falls right into that category. Is you first look at it and you go, this can't be true. And then you look at it, the more you look at that, you look at these other things, it's like, maybe the narrative is not true, but at the very least, it should cause you to question. And maybe we need to look at this. Because if we accept the narrative and we're wrong, we're hurting the very communities we say we want to protect.
great point, and it's a point I illustrate several times throughout my report. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us about your report today. Where can they find more information about this?
Our website is at americanexperiment.org, and we have a wide variety of reports in all of the disciplines that I talked about, including the public safety discipline.
I'll provide a link to your report on our in the description of this podcast. But
Great.
David Zimmer, thank you so much for agreeing to come on today and talk to us about this report. I think it's great information, and I think it's information every elected official should know and say, hey, maybe we need to question what or at least verify what we're looking at.
Well, thanks for having me, Ken.
Thank you for listening, and come back for the next episode of The Bell Post.